Under international rules, captured enemy fighters should be treated as prisoners of war. But Vietnam was no ordinary war, and when captives were taken, anger often decided their fate. What happened to them afterwards was revenge in the most brutal form, and it defined the darkest moments of the war. For context, Vietnam had been torn apart long before American troops arrived. For decades, the country lived under French colonial rule. Many Vietnamese resented this control, and resistance movements grew stronger over time. After years of fighting, France was finally defeated in 1954 in the Battle of Dien Bien Phu. The war ended, but peace did not follow. Instead, Vietnam was split down the middle at the 17th parallel. The North became the Democratic Republic of Vietnam, led by Ho Chi Minh and backed by communist allies like China and the Soviet Union. The South became the Republic of Vietnam, led by anti-communist governments supported by the United States. This division was meant to be temporary. Elections were supposed to reunite the country, but they never happened. Both sides believed the future of Vietnam depended on winning control of the entire country. By the late 1950s, the North decided to act quietly instead of launching a full invasion. They began sending weapons, supplies, and trained fighters into the South through secret routes, later known as the Ho Chi Minh Trail. These fighters became known as the Vietcong. They blended into villages, lived among civilians, and struck when least expected. They assassinated local officials, attacked government offices, sabotaged infrastructure, and punished villagers who cooperated with the South Vietnamese government. By the early 1960s, the conflict was no longer a small internal struggle. The United States feared that if South Vietnam fell, other countries in Southeast Asia would follow. To prevent this, America began sending military advisors. In 1960, there were about 900 U.S. advisors in South Vietnam. Their role was limited on paper. They trained troops, planned operations, and provided intelligence. President John F. Kennedy believed the threat was growing fast. He increased American involvement year by year. By 1963, more than 16,000 U.S. advisors were in Vietnam. They helped build bases, taught counter-guerrilla tactics, and introduced modern weapons and helicopters. Many advisors also went into the field, even though they were not officially combat troops. As fighting increased, the weaknesses of the South Vietnamese army became clear. Many soldiers were young, poorly trained, and lacked motivation. Corruption was common among officers. The Viet Cong used this to their advantage. They relied on ambushes, roadside bombs, and sudden night attacks. They rarely fought head-on. They hit quickly, caused damage, and disappeared into jungles, tunnels, or villages. In 1964, everything changed after the Gulf of Tonkin incident. U.S. Navy destroyers, including the USS Maddox, were sent into the Gulf to gather intelligence. These ships were monitoring North Vietnamese communications and radar activity while operating close to North Vietnam's coastline. On August 2nd, the Maddox reported that it had been attacked by North Vietnamese patrol boats. The ship fired back, aircraft were launched from a nearby carrier, and the incident ended without serious damage to the U.S. ship. 2 days later, the Maddox and another destroyer, the USS Turner Joy, reported a second attack. Radar and sonar operators believed enemy boats were approaching in bad weather. The ships fired for hours into the darkness. However, no wreckage was found, and no clear evidence of an attack ever surfaced. Years later, U.S. officials admitted that the second attack almost certainly never happened and was likely caused by false radar readings and nervous crew. Despite the confusion, President Lyndon Johnson addressed the nation and described the events as deliberate aggression by North Vietnam. The timing was critical. Johnson was facing an election and did not want to appear weak on communism. The incident gave him the political justification he needed to escalate the conflict. Within days, Congress passed the Gulf of Tonkin Resolution in August 1964. The vote was nearly unanimous. The resolution allowed the president to use all necessary measures to repel attacks and prevent further aggression in Southeast Asia. There was no formal declaration of war. Many lawmakers later admitted They didn't fully understand how much power they had just handed over. Soon after, American aircraft began bombing North Vietnam. Ground troops followed. What had started as advice and training turned into full-scale war. By 1965, more than 180,000 U.S. troops were in Vietnam. By 1969, that number reached around 536,000. Tanks, jets, artillery, and helicopters became part of daily life in the countryside. The battlefield itself made the war even worse. Dense jungles, rice paddies, rivers, and small villages gave the Vietcong endless places to hide. Soldiers could walk for hours and still have no idea where the enemy was. Booby traps were everywhere. A single step could mean losing a leg or dying instantly. Helicopters dropped troops into unknown zones where ambushes were common. Airstrikes and artillery were used heavily, but they often hit civilians. Villages were destroyed based on suspicion alone. Over time, the line between enemy fighter and civilian became blurred. By the end of the war, an estimated 970,000 to 3 million Vietnamese were dead, including civilians and soldiers. More than 58,000 Americans were killed. Inside this chaos, U.S. commanders struggled to measure progress. There were no clear front lines and no territory that stayed captured for long. Many leaders turned to a simple and brutal metric: body count. Success was measured by how many enemy fighters were reported killed. Major General Julian Ewell, who led large operations in the Mekong Delta, openly supported this approach. He believed overwhelming firepower was the fastest way to break the Viet Cong. Winning over civilians, often called the hearts and minds strategy, was treated as secondary. Soldiers were pressured to produce numbers. Kill counts became reports, and reports became careers. In practice, this mindset had deadly consequences. Anyone suspected of being Viet Cong could be treated as an enemy. Prisoners were sometimes seen as problems instead of sources of information. Executions became easier to justify. Some units stopped taking captives altogether. One of the most infamous examples was Tiger Force, a platoon from the U.S. 101st Airborne Division. In 1967, they operated in central Vietnam. Later investigations revealed that they tortured prisoners, executed captives, and killed civilians. Soldiers admitted to collecting body parts as trophies. Officers often ignored what was happening. Despite confirmed evidence, no one was punished. At the same time, larger massacres took place. On the morning of March 16, 1968, American soldiers were sent into the village of My Lai in Quang Ngai Province. They were told the area was a Viet Cong stronghold, and that most civilians would be gone to market. Commanders expected heavy resistance. Instead, the soldiers found unarmed villagers going about their morning routines. What followed wasn't a battle. Soldiers began rounding up civilians and forcing them into groups. People were dragged from their homes, pushed into ditches, and shot at close range. Women were assaulted before being killed. Children were shot while clinging to their parents. Elderly men were executed where they stood. Survivors later described soldiers setting fire to huts and killing livestock. There was no warning, no attempt to separate fighters from civilians, and no effort to stop the killings once they began. By the time the unit left My Lai, between 347 and over 500 civilians were dead, according to later investigations. There were no confirmed Viet Cong fighters among the victims. Entire families were erased in a matter of hours. Only a few civilians survived, often by hiding under bodies or fleeing into fields. At the time, the massacre was covered up. Military reports falsely described the operation as a successful battle against enemy forces. Soldiers were praised for high body counts. It took more than a year before the truth began to emerge, after former soldiers spoke out and journalists started asking questions. When the story finally broke in late 1969, it shocked the American public. Photographs and eyewitness accounts showed the reality of what had been done in the name of the war. Trust in the military and the government collapsed further. For many people, My Lai became proof that the war had gone badly wrong, and that ordinary civilians were paying the highest price. These killings didn't happen in isolation. Similar acts occurred in other villages and battles. Reports after the war detailed repeated incidents where prisoners were executed or civilians were killed mistakenly, often counted as Vietcong combatants. The war was chaotic and troops were under constant stress, but the use of extreme violence against captives became a recurring pattern. In January 1968, before the My Lai massacre, the Viet Cong and North Vietnamese launched the Tet Offensive, a massive, coordinated series of attacks on more than 100 cities and towns, military bases, and government offices across South Vietnam. This timing was critical. The attacks occurred during Tet, the Vietnamese Lunar New Year, when soldiers and civilians expected a temporary ceasefire. The Viet Cong used this expectation to disguise their movements and gain the element of surprise. In Saigon, the capital, the attack was immediate and terrifying. Guerrillas infiltrated neighborhoods for days beforehand, moving among civilians in plain clothes, hiding weapons in bags and baskets. Sudden explosions and gunfire erupted in the streets. The U.S. Embassy was attacked, as were police stations and military compounds. Helicopters flew low, dropping troops into chaotic streets filled with panicked civilians. South Vietnamese and American soldiers were on high alert, but the city was unfamiliar terrain for many of the Americans. Any civilian could be an enemy in disguise. Every passerby, every shadowed alley, every rice cart could conceal a Viet Cong fighter. By February 7th, the initial phase of the Tet Offensive had ended, and both sides began counting their losses. Allied forces reported that nearly 25,000 Viet Cong and North Vietnamese soldiers had been killed. Around 5,000 were captured alive. U.S. and South Vietnamese troops lost approximately 2,000 soldiers. Thousands of civilians had also been killed, wounded, or displaced. Holding thousands of captured prisoners during such chaos was almost impossible. Many military units had no secure facilities, few guards, and limited food or water. Soldiers were exhausted from fighting for weeks in the heat and rain. They were angry over ambushes, casualties, and the loss of fellow troops. Under these conditions, prisoners were often seen as dangerous liabilities. Any sudden movement by a prisoner could be interpreted as an attempt to escape, sabotage, or attack. The chaos of the Tet Offensive is perfectly illustrated by the killing of Nguyen Van Lem, a Viet Cong officer. Lem, often called Bai Lop, was accused of leading a team that had killed dozens of South Vietnamese officers, policemen, and civilians in the streets of Saigon that day. Police reports stated that he and his group had murdered at least 34 people, including 24 civilians. When captured, he was unarmed and wearing civilian clothes, blending in with the population just as many Viet Cong did. Brigadier General Nguyen Ngoc Loan, chief of South Vietnam's National Police, confronted Lem on a street filled with reporters and soldiers. In a single decisive moment, Loan drew his pistol and shot the prisoner in the head at point-blank range. Lem fell instantly. Despite the accusations against Lem, his guilt was never fully proven outside of South Vietnamese records. He was still a prisoner at the moment of his death. According to military law, prisoners cannot be executed without a trial. Yet Loan acted immediately. This execution showed how fear, exhaustion, and the constant threat of ambush drove soldiers and officers to take extreme actions. The Tet Offensive blurred the lines between combatant and civilian. Guerrillas disguised themselves, attacked, then vanished. Soldiers had to make instant decisions under enormous pressure. Captured Viet Cong, even if restrained and unarmed, were often treated as immediate threats. Across other towns in South Vietnam, similar acts occurred. Soldiers often reported being ambushed by disguised Viet Cong, then capturing prisoners who might have been too risky to transport. Executions were carried out in the field, sometimes under orders, sometimes spontaneously. The photograph of General Loan shooting Lem became known as the Saigon Execution. It spread quickly through newspapers and television, shocking people around the world. Americans were particularly stunned. Many had believed the war was far away in the jungle, fought between soldiers in uniforms. This image showed that in Vietnam, violence could erupt in the middle of a city in broad daylight against an unarmed man. Anti-war protesters in the United States used the photograph as a symbol of the war's cruelty. They carried it in demonstrations, demanding an end to the fighting and questioning the morality of the American involvement. Critics were outraged that a high-ranking official could shoot a prisoner without trial and face no immediate consequences. In Congress, some lawmakers demanded an investigation. They asked how a government could allow such actions and whether South Vietnam or the United States should hold Luan accountable. The case was even studied by the U.S. Library of Congress, which concluded that, under South Vietnamese law, the killing was illegal. Despite this, in the chaos of war, immediate action was never taken, and General Luan remained a powerful figure in Saigon until the fall of the city in 1975. Years later, the U.S. government revisited the case. In 1978, immigration authorities attempted to deport Luan, calling the shooting a war crime. However, President Jimmy Carter intervened. He decided not to pursue legal action, arguing that too much time had passed and that reopening the case would be politically complicated. Luan then settled in the United States, living quietly until his death in 1998. Despite his calm life after the war, the image of him shooting Lem haunted both history books and public memory. Executing the prisoners was never an official policy during the war. There was no clear order from Washington or Saigon telling soldiers to kill prisoners, but the reality on the ground was very different from what the laws on paper promised. American and South Vietnamese soldiers regularly found the bodies of their friends mutilated or executed. Some soldiers were shot after capture. Others were tortured for information. News traveled fast through units. Stories spread about prisoners being buried alive, beaten to death, or used as examples. North Vietnamese propaganda openly called captured American pilots criminals rather than soldiers. Many were held in harsh conditions, denied medical care, and beaten during interrogations. About 65 American prisoners died in North Vietnamese captivity from execution, torture, wounds, or illness. Each story added fuel to the anger. Soldiers began to believe mercy would not be returned. For South Vietnamese forces, the hatred was even more personal. Many police officers and soldiers had families living in the same villages where Vietcong fighters operated. Some returned home to find their relatives murdered for supporting the government. Vietcong death squads targeted village chiefs, teachers, policemen, and their families. Children were sometimes killed to send a message. When men like General Luan believed a prisoner had murdered civilians, the desire for revenge was overwhelming. In these moments, execution felt like justice, even if it broke the law. Orders from higher command also played a major role. Many U.S. commanders judged success by numbers. This created pressure on soldiers to produce results. In places like the Mekong Delta, entire operations were focused on clearing areas of suspected enemy presence. Operation Speedy Express, carried out in 1968 and 1969, became one of the deadliest campaigns of the war. U.S. units reported killing around 10,800 enemy fighters in 6 months. Later internal reviews suggested that as many as half of those counted were civilians. These deaths often came from airstrikes, artillery, and close-range shootings during sweeps of villages. When Vietnam finally fell in 1975, the shooting stopped and the wars ended. But veterans on both sides still carried guilt and scars. Few of those who killed prisoners were ever held accountable. In the United States, the Army quietly tucked away files on the Tiger Force war crimes. Their own soldiers were never prosecuted, even though they had confessed to heinous acts. For the Vietnamese survivors, the pain was deep. And one of the clearest examples of how this violence scarred an entire generation is the story of Quan Nguyen. He was born in 1958 or 1959 in Hue, South Vietnam, the son of Lieutenant Colonel Nguyen Tuan. During the Tet Offensive in 1968, Vietcong guerrillas attacked his family's home in the Saigon area. In that single attack, Nguyen's parents and 6 of his siblings were killed. He was only 9 years old. He was shot 3 times in the arm, thigh, and skull. Despite these wounds, he survived. For nearly 2 hours, he remained inside the house while his mother bled to death beside him. He didn't cry out, knowing the attackers could still be nearby. When night fell, the child gathered what strength he had left and escaped the house alone. He had lost nearly his entire family in one afternoon. Years later, Nguyen left Vietnam and rebuilt his life in the United States. He eventually joined the U.S. Navy and rose through the ranks, becoming a rear admiral. His story shows how the terror of the Tet Offensive did not end with the fighting. The same fear, rage, and revenge that led to executions in the streets also created survivors who carried the weight of that violence for the rest of their lives.